All right, so we are now recording. So again, thank you all for coming. So first, I'd like to introduce our organization and who I am. So my name is Dr. Shruti Swami, and I am the co-chair of DoSAA, which is the Division on South Asian Americans, which is one of the subdivisions of the Asian American Psychological Association. All of us, and so me speaking on behalf of our volunteers, Sonia Bajwa, who is here, who's one of them, and our DoSAA Executive Committee, we are very, very excited to be hosting this event series, highlighting the broad range of issues, communities, and also strengths and really joyous aspects of South Asian Americans that exist. And within our community, you know, we kind of found this need to talk more about the issues that are happening within our community, because we didn't feel like necessarily those dialogues were happening. And we also just wanted to kind of broaden it and bring more visibility and awareness to the larger mental health community. So with that in mind, we have Dr. Ami Popat-Jain here today speaking to us specifically about beliefs about mental illness and its impact on attitudes towards treatment, an examination of the Asian Indian immigrant population in the United States. So a little bit about Dr. Popat-Jain. She is a licensed counseling psychologist who specializes in culturally informed psychotherapy services for individuals of diverse backgrounds. Her specific areas of focus include multicultural issues, racial identity, women's issues, and trauma. As a culturally informed psychotherapist at her private practice, Dr. Popat-Jain focuses on the context of one's experience and the various intersecting factors that influence the issues bringing clients to psychotherapy. In addition, she has a strong passion for teaching psychology and related courses to both undergraduate and graduate students, and has experience doing so both at Northeastern University and Harvard University. Dr. Popat-Jain also enjoys providing diversity and inclusion consultations in healthcare settings and business corporations, where she has presented on topics such as unconscious biases, addressing discriminatory language, and microaggressions. Dr. Popat-Jain has a background in multicultural research, specifically related to barriers to treatment for South Asian immigrants, microaggressions, and culturally adapted treatments. She completed her Ph.D. at Northeastern University, her pre-doctoral internship at Massachusetts Mental Health Center / Harvard Medical School, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and her postdoc fellowship at Edith Norris Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital. Again, we're very excited to have this event for you all and for her to speak on this topic, which is very meaningful. So I hand it over to you, Ami, and take it away now.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. I was telling Shruti and Sonia before you all joined that this was actually my dissertation baby, this topic, and it has been something that I've sort of tucked away for some time. And as sort of I, started communicating with the organization, felt like it was a good time to kind of bring it back out. So I'm excited to do just that here today. And so just give me one moment to kind of prepare sharing my screen here. Okay. So as Shruti shared, I'm going to be talking about beliefs about mental illness and how that impacts the attitudes around seeking treatment. And I specifically here in my research looked at the Asian Indian immigrant population here in the United States. So what are some of the factors that influence our population, the South Asian Indian population, from seeking treatment? And so after extensive review of the literature, these are sort of some of the themes that really kind of stand out. And so, apologies. And so, the first one being stigma. There continues to be issues around stigma and around comfort and shame with seeking treatment. It's in my private practice, I work with a lot of South Asian Indians, and something that constantly comes up is, do I tell others that I'm in treatment? What will that conversation look like? What will they think of me? Will they think less of me? And so stigma research-wise, anecdotally, based on my practice, is certainly something that influences, seeking treatment. Additionally, beliefs about mental illness. I think it's not unique to hear that at times individuals feel that mental illness isn't real in some ways, and rather is a manifestation of something else. And being depressed or being anxious just means you're not trying enough, or you're not thinking enough, or you're not engaging enough. uh, you know in gender, the research says that generally females are more inclined to seek treatment. Level of acculturation certainly has an impact on whether individuals seek treatment. Values around health, wellness, family, keeping information within the family, feeling comfortable sharing information with the community. We see certainly an underutilization of services. That is very evident in the literature, that Asian Indians, underutilize psychotherapy services. And yet the other piece here is that this population is actually quite at risk of mental health issues. There is a lot of literature, even in talking about immigrants in general and a lot of the mental health issues that they face. And so this isn't just a South Asian immigrant issue, but also a larger immigrant issue per our literature. Okay, so based on all of this information, so I'm seeing an issue here. People are having, these interesting beliefs about mental illness. There's a, underutilization of services. So I want to understand, okay, why, why are people not seeking treatment? What are these beliefs that are influencing them to seek treatment or to not seek treatment, or to be sort of hesitant about seeking treatment? And so there's limited data and research in this area. A lot of, I think in the last few years, there's certainly a lot of growth around mental health issues and the South Asian immigrant population. I think even just a couple of years back, there was such little information about the population, and oftentimes the data that was compiled in research was actually just sort of clumped together with Asians in general, which it is great and also problematic. And one of the problematic pieces of sort of calling Asians one group in general is that there are so many subcultures. We have so many subcultures just in India, and to expand that and see all the subcultures in Asia, it's just a lot. So I think the research really, it didn't so clearly and individualistically speak to the different subcultures. And so we're seeing, the other rationale here that we're seeing is that, these individuals really do have a risk of mental health issues. There's an underutilization of services, and there's the barrier of stigma. So I decided to further explore this topic of beliefs and attitudes with mental illness in this population by conducting a mixed methods approach. And so some of the research questions I had going into this project is A, how do beliefs related to mental illness impact attitudes towards seeking treatment while accounting for various factors, including acculturation, proximity to mental illness, meaning do you or someone you know suffer from mental health issues, gender, age, immigration, first generation versus second generation, identity, whether you identify more as Indian, whether you identify more as American, or somewhere in between, and your level of education. My second research question here was, how do Indian immigrants understand mental illness? Do South Asian Indians actually see mental health symptoms as mental health, or do they think that it's something else? Are there gender differences? And what are the resources utilized by Indian immigrants for mental health issues? And how does stigma then serve here as a barrier? And so this was some fancy model that I got lots of help but put together to see, if all of these variables put together can, in this way, if this model can actually help explain sort of all of the data that's being collected. And so my second hypothesis, going back. So here, basically, I wanted to see if all of these variables came together in this way, in these directions, and helped give us an explanation about how beliefs impacted attitudes towards seeking treatment. So how good of a fit was this model to the data collected? My second hypothesis was that the following themes will likely emerge from a focus group or from the qualitative component of my research study. And so I predicted that themes related to understanding of mental illness, gender, resources, and stigma would come up. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. And so, just kind of boring you a little bit about sort of the methods and the background, I completed basically a survey and I completed a focus group. And so the survey had about 144 participants. So I just want to give you a little bit of background and data on who the people I sort of surveyed were, just so we can kind of get a little bit of an understanding as we move forward and talk about some of the outcomes and the discussions and implications of it. And so, the first piece here was age. And so, more than half of the participants fell between the ages of 26 to 45. However, we had, people as young as 18 and well over 65. Gender was a little bit skewed, so it was about 65% female. When it comes to education and talking about South Asian Indians, South Asian immigrants, 93% had a bachelor's degree or higher, which is not surprising. The proximity to mental illness, so for those who have had experienced some sort of intervention with the mental health system, whether it was through themselves or someone they loved, was about 50-50. So about half of the people surveyed here had some sort of connection to the mental health system or mental illness in general. And interestingly enough, about 55% were first-generation immigrants, meaning they were born in India and immigrated to the United States. And about 45% of the participants were second-generation immigrants, which means they were born in the US and at least one parent immigrated from India. So I think that's kind of interesting that more of our participants were actually first-generation immigrants. And so I used a number of measures here in the survey, including demographics, an acculturation scale, a beliefs about mental illness scale, an Indian cultural beliefs questionnaire scale, and then an attitudes about seeking treatment scale. And so all of these scales were part of the survey, and participants had the opportunity to answer questions and fill things out. And so the acculturation scale looked at sort of basically how much individuals identified with their culture of origin and then identified with the American culture. The beliefs about mental illness scale looked at culturally based beliefs, and this assessed beliefs related to dangerousness, social skills, and incurability of mental illness. The Indian Cultural Beliefs Questionnaire was a questionnaire that I had sort of created based on an adaptation from another scale, and kind of looking at things like karma, evil spirits, puja, how those things would, impact people's views on mental illness. And lastly, the other scale that individuals were asked to complete was a scale about attitudes towards seeking treatment, specifically related to openness and value in treatment seeking. And so in terms of the qualitative component or the focus group, there were some group vignettes looking at South Asians. There were 3 case vignettes. One was an older female suffering from depression. The second case vignette was a middle-aged male suffering from alcohol abuse. And lastly, the third case vignette was college-aged female suffering from psychosis. And so just to give you a little bit of an example, I just wanted to share kind of what one of those vignettes looked like, so that can better help us understand when we talk about the results and the discussion of the study. And so one of the vignettes was, one of your cousin brothers has been drinking a lot more than usual. Your cousin has enjoyed drinking at family parties, is known to always drink a little bit more than others. It's also fairly usual for Jay to either fall asleep at a party or end up getting sick. However, lately you've noticed that Jay appears to be under the influence every time you see him, which is 1 to 2 times a week. You recently heard from another family member that Jay lost his job and it was likely due to his alcohol use. You're particularly worried as, Jay has a young son at home, a wife, and another child on the way. And so this was one of the 3 case vignettes that I had participants look at. And so some of the discussions that they engaged in were around these questions. So, please discuss what you believe to be happening in this situation. Does something need to be done? What will things look like for this individual in the future? Would you seek out assistance? If so, from whom? And what are your thoughts around this case in comparison to the other case vignettes that we're looking at here? So someone asked, what are the most, should I save the questions for the end, Shruti? What do you think?
It's up to you if you feel like you can answer that now in the context of this, or if you prefer.
Okay. So the most common psychiatric conditions in terms of what that I see in my practice or in this research study? In my practice, I mostly see anxiety and depression. But I'm happy to chat more about that later too. In the South Asian community, yeah, anxiety and depression is what I'm seeing a lot of in my own private practice. Thank you. So I recruited through online postings, flyers, cultural events. I did a lot of analysis around the survey. And if you're interested in statistics, I'm happy to talk more about it with you offline. I think most folks find it kind of pretty boring, but I'm a little nerdy like that, so I like talking about all of this. And so, I did a data analysis for the focus group using a specific type of content analysis that, was helpful, and basically looked at the 4 themes of understanding mental illness, gender, resources, and stigma. And so when I sort of put that model together, I looked at all of the variables together, and I also looked at each variable in relationship with the other. And so, I'm not going to go through every single relationship that was found here, but I'm going to highlight a few that are important to take note of. And so participants, we found that the older they were, the more likely they were to identify as stronger with their Indian identity. The younger the participant was, the more likely they were to identify more strongly with their American identity. Individuals who are older, there seemed to be a correlation with having stronger Indian-based beliefs about mental illness. That's related to, puja being a cure, mental illness is dangerous. Oftentimes the reason that we suffer from mental illness has to do with something from our past. Older participants, individuals who are older in age, also had more negative-based beliefs about treatment. Individuals with more positive attitudes about seeking treatment had less negative beliefs about mental illness. And those with a strong identity as Asian American or in the American culture had a less culturally based belief about mental illness. And those who generally had proximity or closeness to mental health issues, had more positive beliefs about mental health. Sorry. And so this was sort of the final kind of diagram that came out from all of those variables. And so what does that actually mean, like in words? Like, what did that translate to? What were some of the findings? And so basically from the survey, the quantitative work that I did, it was found that individuals with more culturally based beliefs had less positive attitudes about seeking treatment. Males had more culturally based beliefs and therefore had less positive attitudes about seeking treatment. First-generation immigrants had less favorable attitudes towards seeking treatment. Lastly, those who had some sort of connection with mental health or mental health issues had a more positive attitude towards seeking treatment. Maria, that's a great question. I did not. And I think that would have provided more richness to the data. And I think if I ever go back and kind of pick up this study again and decide to sort of delve deeper into this, I think that would absolutely be a very brilliant piece to add. So great question, Maria. The answer is no, and wonderful suggestion for the future, perhaps. Of course.
I think there's another question right above that. Did you look at any indicators of SES, like income, parental education, participants' education?
Yeah. And so basically, I didn't very specifically look at SES. However, I sort of interpreted from the level of education that the participants had that they likely were not in the lower SES. And that in general is a limitation of my study, is that the people that I was surveying were likely people on the higher SES, given their very high achieving. I think it was almost 50% had a master's degree, if not higher. So this was a very, very educated, privileged group. And so that is absolutely a limitation of the study in general, for sure. Thank you. Did I miss a part? Was there something about parents' education?
No, I think that was just one of the indicators of socioeconomic status within that question. So
okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. And so what did I see from the focus groups, which in some ways was really interesting? I think having the focus group was a very nice complementary piece to the survey results. I think in some ways it's so nice in black and white to see what people think, but to be able to say, I believe this or I believe that, but then not be able to provide an explanation is kind of, in my eyes, sort of a limitation to the data. And so I always think sort of a qualitative component or an opportunity where you get to hear more of a story or a narrative can really enhance the data. And so it was very nice to be able to pair the survey with then having sort of a focus group. And so one of the themes was around understanding of mental illness. So I wanted to understand what does this population understand about mental illness? Do they see mental illness for what it is, or do they see it for something else? And so this quote here talks about, one of the case vignettes in response to that, asking sort of what they saw in the case and does this person sort of need treatment? And sort of it was interesting because the initial sort of piece was the person needs to go to a doctor, they need to rule out if something's medically wrong with them, have somebody from the family go and interact with this person, see what's going on. Maybe this person could volunteer or do something outside of the home that could then improve their mental health. And so, there was some sort of indication here that individuals felt like whatever the case vignette was, whether it was related to, I believe this one was related to the psychosis, that really there was sort of like, we need to do a medical rule out, we need to get a family member to help and to sort of support this person, and we need to get this person sort of out of the house doing something so that they're useful. And really there wasn't this, oh my goodness, they need to go to the emergency department, or oh my goodness, they need to have a psychiatric evaluation. So, there was some, again, indication that yes, there was something happening here and there was something wrong. And yet the first thing was sort of this medical piece. And then the second piece was sort of, let's get family involved. And then the third piece was, let's kind of do something to sort of change the mental state related to kind of environment. I have some really interesting questions here. Was there data on the region of origin? And if so, there was not. There absolutely was not. However, I think, and also the sample size was quite small to be able to see, I think, very statistically significant effects, given that there are only 144 participants data that ended up being used. I don't know if collecting the region of origin on the individuals we would have been able to make any true interpretations. However, I think if we were to conduct a study similar with a much larger sample size, I think this could certainly serve us well and really provide us with more data based on region. I think even within India, we have so many subcultures. So I think that would be very rich data, sort of in a larger study. I want to know if you saw a connection between being religious and not wanting treatment. And so again, individuals' sort of religious preference or level of religiosity wasn't directly measured. However, I think that would be an interesting question to sort of use as a follow-up. I think understanding more about the religion would certainly give us more richness to the data. I think it would be super interesting for future research to include cultural variations. Absolutely. I totally and completely agree with you, and I very much appreciate that sort of thought and insight and recommendation. So thank you. I will try to continue to keep up with questions as I do some adjunct faculty work, and so I feel like I'm sort of used to juggling the presenting and the answering of questions. So I'm doing the best I can, but please feel free to kind of call me out, or Shruti or Sonia, feel free to kind of bring my attention if I'm missing something. Thank you. Okay. So related to gender, a piece that was very interesting was that there was this sort of taboo around women asking for help, and that women's roles were very much around needing to complete household tasks and maintain harmony in the home. And so if a woman were to go and get treatment or were to go and spend time doing something else, then they wouldn't be able to actually attend to sort of their primary responsibilities. And so it wasn't acceptable for then women to go out and sort of seek help, because that's not their purpose and that's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to, even if they're not feeling well, they're supposed to pretend that they're feeling well and to sort of continue forward and move forward. And so this theme of resources, sort of trying to understand what resources the participants felt could be utilized for the different case vignettes that were supplied to them. And so it was interesting to see that there were some sort of indication that, family members involving family was important, going to an elder or going to somebody who had a good relationship with the person could be helpful. There was also a very interesting comment made around sort of the shame and the stigma and sort of this inability to feel comfortable to use resources around them. This idea that we don't even talk about sort of what colleges or students are attending. How can we, there's so much sort of secrecy around certain topics, that how do we then extend that and feel comfortable talking about other things like mental illness? So what was the gender breakdown of the participants in the focus group? Excellent question. They were all women. They were all women, which is an indicator in itself. Absolutely, Tara. All right, so stigma. Stigma was certainly an issue that was brought up. I was pleasantly surprised to hear one of the participants felt comfortable talking about their own experience and exposure to mental illness in their own family, and how that brought about a lot of shame and stigma in their own family, and how there was a lot of embarrassment around having friends over or talking about it openly, that their mom suffered from, I believe it was a very serious mental health issue. And so this feeling of isolation and shame and stigma and feeling really alone in whatever this person was going through with their family, and not feeling comfortable asking for help and feeling embarrassed. And I think this kind of goes back to some of our beliefs, or some of the very traditional Indian beliefs about mental illness, that, something must have been done in a past life, or this must be poor karma. There must have been something that this person did to sort of deserve this, which, I think can be certainly a problematic and maybe unhelpful at times stance. And so sort of discussing this. Okay, so apologies. I see a couple of comments here. Must must have some association with how women are more likely to seek treatment compared to men. Yes, Vidya, that is pretty consistent throughout the literature, regardless of sort of cultural background, that women in general are more likely to seek treatment in comparison to men. It is interesting and additionally not surprising that men had not volunteered to participate in this. I certainly, if I were to conduct a similar study in the future, would love to sort of see how I can encourage. I mean, I offered like gift cards and things. So there were a lot of like, enticing sort of pieces here, and there was chai and samosas and the works really, and yet we just kind of attracted women to the focus group. Also, if the consensus was that women should adhere more to domestic duties, yes, that was an idea that came from women about other women. That is a great point, Uttara. Yes, that is very true, and that is very interesting. And so sort of discussing here, so going back to that initial research question, sort of how do beliefs impact attitudes while accounting for the acculturation, proximity to mental illness, gender, age, immigration, identity, and education? What does that all mean? What does this all mean, right? And so individuals who, again, were less acculturated, so more traditional, had more culturally based beliefs. Individuals who were less cultural, who were also less acculturated, also had more negative and fear-based beliefs about mental illness. Males had more culturally based beliefs, while female had less culturally based beliefs, which then in turn meant that men were less likely to have positive treatment-seeking behaviors. In terms of proximity, it was found that if someone was impacted by mental health, that they were more likely to seek treatment and have positive attitudes about it. And so this was sort of the relationship that kind of came out. And we'll talk a little bit more about clinical implications as we go forward. Were any of the focus group women married to South Asian men? I'm curious if they told their partners they were participating. I believe that a lot of the women were married. I don't know if and what they told their partners. I love what I'm reading from Lavanya here, that a lot of highly educated and high income earning US raised South Asians disclosed to me they were in therapy. A lot of kids are sort of getting mental health services. Could it be that far more South Asians are seeking proper treatment than is reported? Yes, I think that could certainly be a part of it. And I want to talk a little bit more about this in our discussion piece. And I'm just kind of looking at the time. I really want us to get to that piece there. I think that there's definitely the shame and stigma that is keeping people from sort of seeking treatment. But interesting, even in your comment, you say that that the kids are seeking treatment. I wonder how old the families are, how old the adults are in that who are seeking treatment. Because currently in my private practice, where well over half my clientele is South Asian, everyone is in their 20s and 30s. I do not have anyone over the 40 or above who is South Asian in my practice, which I find absolutely fascinating and really related to some of the things that were found here in the research. So Lata, I think you're right. It depends on the age and immigration status. You talk to people in their 20s and 30s, so age, exactly. I love this discussion that's going on, and I look forward to sort of spending the last couple of minutes here, and US raised, of course, speaking a little bit more about kind of the discussion piece here. And so the second question here that I looked at was, how do Indian immigrants understand mental illness or their gender differences? And so for the depressed woman, they described her to be lonely and isolated and depressed, but they also wanted to sort of look at a number of other factors and weren't necessarily like, this person needs treatment. When we talked about the person with substance abuse issues, it's interesting, they understood that the person who was drinking, that this man who was drinking, they sort of not justified it, but said, gosh, this person must be really stressed. So they must be drinking to cope with something and they need some sort of help. And maybe an older brother, an uncle, or a cousin can come in, another male can come in who they listen to and speak to them about this issue. In the psychosis example, in the psychosis case vignette, it was seen that participants were more quickly able to say that, it would be helpful for them to receive both medical and psychiatric treatment. In terms of gender, again, speaking to how sort of women have more responsibilities in the home. So it may be harder for them to express their emotions or ask for help since they have a lot of responsibilities to take care of. And again, with the alcohol abuse situation, participants very quickly said, well, having another older male who this person listens to would be helpful. And so research question 3, what resources are utilized by Indian immigrants for mental health issues? How does stigma impact this? And so participants very quickly wanted to go to their community first, look for people who were elder, respected, and see if they could help out. There were times where, participants eventually got to the point where they said perhaps a psychologist or psychiatrist could be helpful in this sort of mental health presentation. However, oftentimes it wasn't the first recommendation that was given. There were a lot of other things that were sort of thrown out there as kind of what resources could be used for the individual that we're reading about in the case vignette. Stigma in general was brought up in a general discussion, but, it was very salient and very clear that stigma sort of made it difficult to sort of have the first thing be, we want this person to just talk to a psychologist or talk to a psychiatrist. And sort of an interesting piece that came up also in the focus group related to stigma is there was this fear that if somebody went to therapy, that somebody else would find out. And then that would look bad on them or about them. And so one of the other participants said, hey, but there's this thing called HIPAA and there's these privacy laws and they can't talk about, if you're seeing a therapist, that therapist can't go around unless there's safety issues and say that they're seeing you in therapy. And so there was this sort of back and forth and push on that. Well, my cardiologist or my, general practitioner or, my specialist, I've heard them talk about other people. And so I just assumed that that was the same in therapy. And so there is that fear, it's not as stigmatizing if sort of your endocrinologist is saying, oh, I saw so-and-so versus your therapist saying, oh, I saw so-and-so. There's more stigma associated with that, which in itself is problematic. And so, sort of some of the issues or limitations that kind of come up or observations around the focus group was that folks didn't really have a safe space to talk about mental health issues. They didn't feel like they had this initial starting point or grounding place that they could go to sort of if they need help. There was certainly an openness that I felt from the focus group around talking more about this. But what was interesting is they wanted it more to be like, oh, Ami Beta, could you come back and do chai time or something versus oh, I'm really interested in treatment. Maybe I could, go and find a therapist. I think some of the other interesting pieces that I found were sort of being a second generation immigrant certainly influenced my sort of way of looking at things. Being a female was kind of something about my positionality that may or may not have influenced the focus group. I think in the focus group, there was certainly at times a dual relationship because some of the people that were there, I sort of had another relationship with. Something related to the survey in general that I found very interesting was that I must have gotten 50 or 60 email responses from individuals who filled out my survey. And they wanted to tell me why or why not they felt comfortable seeking treatment. What were they afraid of or not afraid of? What that looked like, or why they felt uncomfortable, or kind of just their kind of feedback on this survey, which showed to me, first of all, that this was the first time they had gotten to think about mental health in this way. And secondly, there was a lot of curiosity around this. So I'm trying to catch up. How can one be sure that older community member would actually help and not dissuade? Also, isn't there a hesitancy to talk to others about mental health? These statements are confusing to me. So when talking to an elder member in the community, it's first more finding an elder member sort of in the family. So keeping it as close to the family as possible felt sort of the safest. And so, if for example, this person we talked about, Jay, the vignette I shared about Jay, if there was concern about Jay, it would be helpful to talk to an uncle or somebody who was part of like that inner network. Does that make sense, Letha? In practicality, people don't want family to know. I think there are times where people feel really stuck and they feel that the first place that they can start, if they can't figure it out on their own, is to go to a family member. At least that's what I had sort of seen in my research. 15 minutes. Okay. Thank you, Sonia. The stigma definitely keeps people from seeking help. Exactly. They don't want to be considered crazy. Vidya talks about one of her interests in looking at anxiety and to look at similar variables. Anxiety can be overlooked as worry. Yeah, I think this is very great, Vidya. A very great comment and interest. Thank you. Okay. And so, what were sort of the clinical implications here, right? So, given that men had more stronger beliefs that either mental illness was dangerous or people with mental illness had social difficulties or that mental illness was not curable, it shows that they're sort of socialized in this certain way to think that mental illness is, has sort of negative connotation to it. And so somehow educating males around mental health issues, the prevalence, efficacy of treatments, could be really helpful. I think we need to certainly find ways to further educate males around mental health issues. Generational gaps and differences here, I think it could be helpful for us to find ways in which we can sort of access the first generation immigrant population and figure out a way to kind of get them to open up and be have some comfort or some, at least interest in considering treatment. I think, talking about exposure and attitude. So folks who had some sort of relationship with the mental health system had more positive attitudes. And so if we came from a stance where when we have positive experiences seeking mental health, if we could then go and talk about it with the people around us, perhaps people would feel more comfortable seeking treatment, talking about it. And so I certainly think the second generation immigrants are certainly do that. I certainly see people in my age group and in my generational group doing that. And I think there's still some room to do that in kind of the first generation group. And so, do we model seeking mental health treatment in our ZTV serials, or do we do it in the Bollywood movies? And I know there's some of that going on, but do we, find support groups and ways that we can sort of engage these individuals? I think something that would be really helpful is to train clinicians. And, I think given that there's limited research around South Asian immigrants in general, I don't know that there's a ton of education about this specific group happening in graduate school and different trainings. So I think it would be very helpful for clinicians to sort of understand the diverse needs of the group based on all these variables that I talked about here. Having safe spaces, I think, to talk about mental health issues can be very helpful, like a chai time or something like that. Um, and lastly, what was interesting is that many of the people here were highly educated, and yet a lot of them still held very negative beliefs about mental illness. So how can we sort of shape that and kind of talk a little bit more about that in a way that's helpful? So, our conclusion here was that folks with greater culturally based beliefs were less likely to seek treatment. Who were less acculturated or identified more with the Indian identity had more culturally based beliefs. Males had more culturally based beliefs and were less likely to seek treatment. Those who had had some sort of relationship with the mental health system had stronger attitudes toward treatment. And lastly, individuals looked into their very, very inner communities, so their immediate family circles, if they felt like it needed to go outside of the immediate nuclear family before necessarily seeking treatment outside of the family or outside of the home. So I think future directions, more focused groups, a lot of you have added some very, very interesting recommendations around learning about different regions of India and background, religiosity, things like that. And so we have a few minutes left. And let me see how much I can get through the chat. And then if we have time, we can kind of talk about some of these things. But I'm happy, instead of going into breakout rooms, to just kind of do it here.
Dr. Popat-Jain, would you like it to be open for people to verbally ask their questions, or are you okay with the chat being open?
I'm okay with them verbally asking questions. I just want to make sure that it looks like there's just some commentary here, but not necessarily, FYI, comments only at this point. Thank you. So I would love to kind of take the last 9 minutes we have here. I can sort of, I kind of unshared it, but I really would like to keep it on these questions here. I'm curious to hear kind of how people would answer these questions and what they think, because I don't know that we have time. I mean, I guess we could go into small groups for like 5 or 6 minutes and come back, right?
Yeah, I think so. It might, just in terms of sharing information with everyone, we could do it here if you're comfortable. It's really what you would
Okay.
prefer. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. So I have kind of the questions kept here. How do we access first-generation immigrants? How do we access males? How do we help individuals with more culturally based beliefs and more negative beliefs about mental illness see the benefit in treatment? And how do we help change attitudes in general about seeking treatment? And so I'm interested in, at this point, these last couple of minutes here, to have a discussion verbally, and feel free to sort of just speak up if you have something to say, or if you're more comfortable kind of just putting something in the chat. I'm happy to read that aloud. I feel like I did a lot of talking, and I saw a lot of really interesting questions and comments. And so I would love to hear from others at this point if they have ideas around these questions, again, either in the chat or you can just kind of speak, whatever works for you.
I mean, if you want us to jump right in.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking a lot of the research that's been done in the past, or the research that's currently, that people are engaging in. Oftentimes we look at the South Asian community and the utilization of services from a deficit model. So we're looking at, yes, it's very important to know the barriers, and it's important to know, what kind of prevents us from going to seeking treatment. But I think what we have to start doing is looking at it more from a strengths-based perspective, and in terms of trying to focus on, yes, everyone that's gone to therapy or gone to counseling or sought any type of treatment, what has their experience been like? And what's actually happening in those sessions? What's the comfort level? Are you looking for a particular kind of counselor or therapist to work with? Is it short term, long term?
Yeah.
And I think just actually talking about the actual experience and giving voice to that experience and sharing those perspectives, I think that's another kind of direction to go in. And that's actually part of also my doctoral work right now at this point. I'm in my dissertation, so that's kind of the focus of my study that I'm going with.
I love that. I think that's such a great point. I am learning about this, I think, anecdotally and professionally in my practice. And, I don't know if this is any help, but I can share that what I've seen in my work with South Asians in therapy is that, they're really liking to work with sort of a culturally competent therapist. They're liking to a lot of them enjoy having a South Asian therapist because they feel like they don't have to explain every little thing. I think a lot of them come in with past therapy experiences and talk about having to explain like cultural nuances that then sort of strike the therapist in a particular way, and it feels a little bit challenging for them to then open up with a non-South Asian therapist. And so that's some of the feedback that I personally have received, that individuals are liking therapy with a South Asian provider because they can talk about things and not have to spend half the session sort of explaining, what does it mean that there was like a puja, or what does it mean to have
right,
or what is the role of grandparents, or the culture around sort of when you're in high school and in college and in the younger ages around like sort of hiding relationships and dating and things like that necessarily are not sort of things that maybe people outside of our culture understand very quickly and may need some more instruction around, if that makes sense. So I think that's great. I really do like your the looking at it from a strengths-based model. And I wonder if building upon that, sort of sharing the data that you're talking about, can then help this very issue that I'm talking about here and getting more people comfortable with coming to therapy.
Yeah, so exactly, like looking at it from like that narrative perspective, and similar to how you had in the focus groups where you had snippets of what people were saying, just sharing those narratives. And I think, the more qual research that's done in terms of interviews and that kind of information that's put out, the more people will read the actual experiences. And maybe that might start to chisel away a little bit at the stigma. And I think this is like a long-term process that we have to go through. But I think these are like baby steps in order to get to that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your comments and your ideas. I appreciate that.
I have I have a question for you. I think one demographic that seems to a lot of times be underreported is now the number of, I guess, Indian Americans or South Asian Americans who have a biracial identity, because there's a very high rate now of intermarriage now between South Asians and I think most of us know at least one relative or friend who was married a non-South Asian. Have you dealt with South Asians of a mix? Well, I want to be politically correct, but have you dealt with South Asians that come from a more diverse racial or cultural background? And what are their...
Not South Asian specifically. However, I have worked with Asians who identified had more than one racial identity, but not particularly with South Asians. I think honestly, as this generation has children, we're going to see more and more of that in the next generation. I don't know how many adults we have right now, and I say adults because that's sort of been my focus both research-wise and clinically. I don't know that we have a ton of adults at this point who identify as South Asian and something else. However, I think the product of this second generation will result in a lot of children who are biracial, and at that point there's going to be a whole nother plethora of research that needs to be
because I feel like the future there's going to be more there's going to be more Kamala Harris's of the world
yes or absolutely
Yeah, it's not going to remain so homogenous as in having two South Asian parents.
I very much agree, and I look forward to that. I very much look forward to that. So thank you. I saw that somebody made a comment about introducing or maybe having sort of efforts to destigmatize mental health in different religious areas. And I think that's a great point. What are people's thoughts on that? How do people think their temples or their mosques would respond to kind of having flyers or information about mental health there? I think that's a very interesting point and question and thought.
I want. Oh,
sorry. You can go ahead, Tommy. Sorry. I'll go
I just wanted to make a comment. So I'm going to be starting my diagnostic practicum at a Muslim counseling center this upcoming fall. And I was looking through their website, and they came up with like this entire like treatment around like incorporating like Islam, and that actually attracts more like conservative Muslims. And they were telling me more about that. And I thought it was very interesting. So I think that your first question, how do we access first generation immigrants? A lot of the immigrants are like very rooted in their culture and religion. And I think that incorporating that into like therapy would probably maybe attract them more to getting mental health, because because I don't know, I feel like a lot of times people don't, that generation don't want to come in to seek mental health assistance because it seems so like different and it's just very out of the norm. And I think that maybe incorporating their own backgrounds into therapy would help them, maybe make them more comfortable, attract them. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a really great point. I think that's a brilliant way to really access that first generation is through religion. And I wonder, I think that's a brilliant idea. And I wonder about some of the challenges that could come up with that. I wonder sort of how, sort of the people who run these different religious organizations, how they feel about mental health and what would be their sort of comfort level with using sort of their space as a platform. And so I think there's a lot of room there for discussion and growth. I think it's fascinating. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Absolutely, Prabha, about the collectivistic culture. I see that a lot in my work where, a lot of times some of my South Asian clients have a very hard time understanding this individualistic perspective. And it's something that we can kind of talk about together, which I think is great. How, there is this very stark contrast in the Western American culture and how it can be hard to kind of navigate both cultures with sort of the differences in the individualistic and collectivistic culture. Yeah, thank you.
So I wanted to just quickly point out, I know that we are at the end of our official time. So for those of you who do need to head out, feel free to do that. I know Dr. Popat-Jain, you said that you do have a little bit of time to stay and chat if you want to. So if anyone is interested in staying longer, we do have a few more minutes. Otherwise, you are free to leave. But thank you all for being here. I really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you, Dr. Popat-Jain.
Thank you. Thank you all for such a rich discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Leta. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you.
So I mean, this is Lavanya. I'm actually from New Jersey, where there's some parts of New Jersey, there's like a Hindu temple every 1 mile.
Oh yeah.
And again, it's mostly Middlesex, Somerset, certain counties that's heavily concentrated with South Asians. But at least from my observations, when I've gone sort of temple hopping, quote unquote, I've never seen
I love that term. I've never heard it. Temple hopping.
I mean, I've never found in any of the temples any type of like flyers for any type of support groups or social services. And what I find too is 99% of the time, the people who do come to these temples are the immigrant Indians with their children. And I've talked to some of the temple leadership, and just from conversation, I don't talk about mental health issues, but I still gauge that they're very conservative, and they don't want the temple to be a space to have. It's not like for example, in like masjids or churches, they do. I think, especially I think they. Well, actually, I shouldn't speak from masjids, but I know in my interactions with the Christian community, they have more of those available, or even synagogues and churches. But I don't find that in the South Asian model. It's more religious based or cultural heritage programs. But I
wonder, I'm not saying definitely, but I wonder if a lot of the perspective around mental health in those sort of more conservative communities is that, you just need to believe in God and look to God and ask God for what you want. And so I wonder if and how there's space for both of those things to be held true there. And I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think there's any clear-cut answers, but just based on what I've seen, I wouldn't feel comfortable going to like the local pundits and telling him, although I think in Islam or in masjids traditionally, people have gone to the imams for religious counseling or guidance, or even like in churches or synagogues, they go to the rabbi or the pastors.
I think also, speaking of the religiosity piece, if we're just looking at South Asians, specifically from the continent of Asia, India, and whatever other countries you choose to include in that, but there's also a whole other sect of West Indians that are traditionally Indian, and some consider themselves South Asian, some consider themselves West Indian, and their religiosity piece is a whole other criteria that isn't even captured in some of the research that many of us are doing. So that's another variable in the mix of how do we actually measure the religiosity and who's identifying as what, because at the end of the day, we don't dictate how someone identifies. They identify as however they want to.
Absolutely. There's so much space for us to be more inclusive in our research, and yet there's still so much to do that I feel like it's going to be time before we can get there and really parse apart these different groups. I feel like we're still in a stage where a lot of our research is very generalist based. And I think there's so much space and there's such a gap in the literature around more specific topics and more specific subgroups. And so I love that point, and I think it's a very salient one. It absolutely is that people identify in all sorts of different ways, and we put this sort of large label of South Asian Indian or Indian immigrant or whatever it is, and really, who is identifying with that? Who are we leaving out? And so I think that's a great point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah. Yeah, Sanjita.
Oh, sorry. Okay, right now, since I'm a current senior in high school, so for my graduation project, I was kind of because of quarantine and COVID, I feel like that had a huge increase in mental health and that awareness. And I've been seeing some studies online, and just in just general US, and how mental health has changed. And they did subgroups of racial ethnicities, and then how the anti-Asian hate movement happened, that caused a lot more researchers to kind of focus on Asian Americans. But see, I think Asian American has a different definition in America than it would have in the UK. Because in the UK, when they say Asian American, they think of South Asians, because that's predominantly the Asians they have. But here it's mainly East Asians. But I know that obviously yes, the South Asian Americans, they have stigma, but we all sort of face mental health, anxiety, increased anxiety and depressive symptoms. But I just could not find enough research in that. And while you were talking about your presentation, I kind of your group was a privileged group and they were educated. So it kind of made sense that they would have the access and they would fill out the surveys to give you the data, but is that like, I feel like there's a barrier into why I could not find any more information on why South Asian Americans, like from like other, were not giving your voice into how mental health was perceived for them during COVID specifically.
Yeah.
Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's just so much work to be done. And I feel like that's sort of just kind of my answer for today. But I really think that there's such a gap. And I think you're totally right. I think this conflict of, are we Asian? I feel like, even when you fill out the census forms, like, does Asian feel like the right thing, or is it something else? And so being able to talk about the South Asian experience, there just hasn't been work done on that in specific subtopics. And that was sort of why even I went into my dissertation and looked at this. I mean, really the question I'm asking is pretty broad, and yet there was very little literature to kind of compare or corroborate with when I was doing my study. And so the short answer is that there's much work to be done. And I'm so glad that even as you're completing high school, that you're taking this on and seeing it as really an issue. Kudos to you. Kudos, truly honest. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question from Isha, I think. So you can go ahead, Isha.
Hi, yeah. I'm an undergrad studying clinical psych, and I am really interested in, like, I guess, why our culture emphasizes certain practices that might not be the most helpful to mental health. Like, why did those originate? And like, how do we work with that? So like, one question I have is, why do we use criticism for our kids instead of compassion? I don't know if that would be like a research question, or if anyone has any like thoughts on that, but I'm just really interested in, like, why do that if it's like so counterproductive? And I guess, like, where does privilege come into that? Like, what histories have informed that?
So I think that's a fascinating question with so many layers. I think based on sort of my clinical hat and my clinical experience, sort of parents were raised a certain way in a certain culture, and for whatever reason, it was effective, and that allowed them to be successful. And by successful, I mean they were able to come here, immigrate to the United States, and be able to sustain a lifestyle here, right? And so whether or not that impacted their relationship with their parents or relationship with other people or themselves, at the end of the day, it allowed them to achieve some sort of objective, tangential success, right? And so at the end of the day, that's kind of what they know works. And so I wonder if sort of that is the way that that's the way that, my parents talked to me. It allowed me to come here and be a doctor, come here and be an engineer, come here and be a lawyer. So why wouldn't I just do that? It worked on me. Like, who cares what happened in the process or how that impacted me? At the end of the day, I achieved X or I achieved Y. Does it really work though, Lata? It depends on work. It depends on what you define as work. Did they, check off a box of they, did a STEM profession, or does it check off a box that they have very strong emotional well-being? It depends on the box we're trying to check off, right? And I think right now, the focus of the population you're talking about, Isha, is this success, and success defined by degrees and income and marriage and all of these other objective criteria that we're expected to meet. I don't know if that answers your question, Isha, or partially at least.
Yeah, that's super interesting. That's a super interesting way to think about it. And I guess, like, privilege could tie in because, like, the scarcity of economic opportunities, all of that, like, they were kind of forced to have that mindset, and like, compassion is too risky maybe. So yeah. But thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Thank you, Isha.
I think maybe we can take the time to wrap up now. If you do have further questions, I know Dr. Popat-Jain, you put your email in the chat, but I can also send it out to everyone.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I can send it out to everyone afterwards, and also just to give you all a heads up once the video is posted onto our YouTube channel, just so if you want to share it with other people who might find it useful, who weren't able to make the event, you can definitely do that. But thank you all so much for coming. Please do stay tuned for other events that we will be having every other month to maybe a little bit more frequently during the summer on a wide variety of topics relevant to South Asians more broadly. So I think it's something that, pass on to other people, let them know. But yeah, I really appreciate you all being here, and Dr. Popat-Jain for your time and just your passion for this topic, because as everyone, here hopefully can see too, it's something close to all of our hearts and communities and need some more focus on. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure to chat about my research and to have this very meaningful and important discussion with you all. And I hope we can all sort of take these discussions we're having here, and as part of breaking the stigma, bring these conversations up in other realms of our life. So thank you all, and have a good night.